Hey gang, using the promo code MTGMudsta, one word, all caps, will get you 10% off orders of $10 or more at Flipside Gaming, Original Magic Art, and orders of singles at Multizone. If they don't have what you're looking for, you could check out TCG Player and use my affiliate link to help support the channel. Looking for a way to bling out your deck and not spend a fortune? Alter Sleaze can help with that, and you can help with the channel at the same time by using my affiliate link. Or, if you're looking to join the Goblin Gang, you can always support me through Patreon. Hey gang, and welcome back. Today we have another piping hot serving of fresh Commander content, filmed safe and socially distanced. Mark is playing his Wrexial deck, keeping 2 islands, a swamp, Jwar Isle Refuge, Nemesis of Reason, and a Cold Steel Heart. Derek has built Obuun, keeping a forest, 2 plains, mountain, horizon canopy, explore, and Nissa Worldwaker. Chris has built Akiri Fearless Voyager, keeping a Soul Ring, Stoneforge Mystic, Sunforger, Sacred Foundry, Dockside Extortionist, and Open the Armory. And last to the party is Mistform, with me keeping 3 islands, Curse of the Swine, Mind Over Matter, Rogue's Passage, and Cyclonic Rift. Mark wins the die roll and starts us off. Mark plays his Tap Jwar Isle Refuge, which comes in and gains him 1 life. Derek plays a forest. I play an island and pass to Chris. Chris takes 2 from an untapped Sacred Foundry and then casts a Soul Ring. Mark plays an island and casts a Cold Steel Heart, naming black as it enters. Derek plays a Plains and casts Burgeoning. I play an island, and this lets Derek put out a mountain. Chris didn't draw another land sadly, and he casts a Stoneforge Mystic. He announces he'll go and find the Sword of the Anime, passing. Mark plays an island, and Derek puts out a Horizon Canopy. Mark then passes. Derek draws, and then casts Explore, drawing again, and he plays out a Plains. He then passes. I drop an island for turn, and cast a Grand Architect. Chris gets lucky, hitting a Bloodstained Mire, and he shortcuts, sacrificing it so he can cast and equip the Sword of the Anime onto his Stoneforge. He then goes to combat, swinging at a Mark for 2. This lets Chris find a land from attacking, and he does so at the same time as he goes to find 1 from the Bloodstained Mire. Mark draws and plays a Swamp. He plays a Storm Surge Kraken, which isn't pumped because Wrexial is still in the command zone. Derek casts an Arcane Signet, and then taps out completely for Migration Path, passing as he searches for some lands. I play a Rogue's Passage, and tap the Architect to make 2 colorless that can be only used on artifacts. This lets me play out a Sapphire Medallion, and I then need only play 3 mana for Mistform Ultimus, passing to Chris. Chris draws, and brings out Akiri in his main phase. He then plays out a Dockside Extortionist, and we count up the artifacts and enchantments, which has Chris gaining 4 treasures. He then swings a Stoneforge at Derek, drawing a card from Akiri's trigger, and then going to find a land, all of which happens before even connecting for 2. He then passes to Mark. Mark plays an island, and brings out Wrexial in his main phase. This had the added benefit of pumping the Kraken, thanks to Lieutenant, and Mark swings the now 7/7 at Chris. Chris just takes the hit, and Mark then passes. Derek draws for turn, and also brings in his commander, playing out Obuun. He plays a tap Stirring Wildwood, putting a +1/+1 counter onto his commander from the landfall trigger. We then see an Embodiment of Fury hitting the field, and he passes to me. I draw and play an island. I cast a reduced costing Sage of Fables and pass to Chris. Chris untaps, draws, and plays a Blade of Selves. He moves to equip it onto the dockside, and it resolves. Moving to combat, I respond by Cyclonic Rifting the blade back to Chris's hand. And he goes at Mark again, drawing a card from Akiri, and then finding a land before connecting for 2 with the Stoneforge Mystic. Mark draws and plays an island. He goes to combat, swinging the Small Kraken as Mark calls it at Derek. Derek decides to just take the 7, and in his post-combat main phase, Mark then plays at a Pursued Whale, who comes in and makes his opponents a 1/1 pirate token that forces us to attack each combat step if able. We don't sadly have the red pirate tokens, so we use mirrors. Derek taps 5 for Mirari's Wake in his main phase, and he then loses 1 as he taps a Horizon Canopy to help pay for Nissa Worldwaker. He upticks her to animate a land, and then plays a plains, putting a +1/+1 counter onto his commander. He goes to combat, animating a plains with Obuun, which becomes a 5/5. He swings the pirate and Nissa land at me, at Obuun and the plains at Chris, and lastly decides to swing the embodiment at me as well. I block the pirate token with Mistform, taking the rest, while Chris takes the whole hit, 6 of which is commander damage. Derek then passes. I draw and tap 4 mana for reduced costing Curse of the Swine, where X is 3. I hit 2 of Mark's creatures, unable to target the Kraken, and Derek's animated forest. I have to attack because of the pirate, and rather than get blocked, I tap my blue creatures for colorless mana that can only be spent on artifacts. I then still have to swing my pirate token, which I do so by sending it at Chris. Chris blocks with the dockside, and it takes out the pirate, and I pass. Chris draws and recasts the Blade of Selves. He puts it back onto the dockside and goes to combat. The original dockside goes at Mark along with the pirate token, and makes a token copy headed at Derek and I. This gives Chris 10 treasures as they enter, and Akiri goes at Nissa, and the Stoneforge heads at Derek. Mark double blocks the original dockside with his pigs, and Derek blocks the Stoneforge with his pig token as well. Before damage is dealt, Chris uses 1 treasure to activate Akiri, unattaching the sword from the Stoneforge to tap it and make it indestructible. Chris also remembers to draw from Akiri's triggers at this point, and then goes to find a basic from the Sword of the Anime. Mark and I then end up each taking 1 from the unblocked creatures, and Chris then plays a strip mine in his post-combat main phase. He casts a Skull Clamp, and clamps a pirate token, drawing 2. We then see an Umezawa's Jitte, and Chris passes to Mark, discarding down to 7. Mark counts up his lands, and plays out Nemesis of Reason. He swings both of his piggy tokens at Chris, who has no choice but to take the hit, and Mark then passes. Derek draws, and plays an Arid Mesa, gaining a counter on Obuun. He then cracks it, losing 1 to go in for another land, and puts out a Temple Garden, taking 2. This gives Obuun another +1/+1 counter, and with one of the landfall triggers from the embodiment, he also animates a plains, making it a 3/3, which gets pumped by the Wake to be a 4/4. Derek then pays 1 to sacrifice the Horizon Canopy to draw a card, and we then see him animating the Stirring Wildwood, and he goes to combat. This has Obuun's trigger going off, and he animates a mountain to make it a 7/7, which gets pumped to be an 8/8 by the Wake. He then taps 4 creatures, sending them all at Chris. Before moving to damage though, Chris sacrifices treasures to cast Swords to Plowshares, and then sacrifices 4 more to cast Fury Storm. He copies the swords with it, and gets another copy to copy the swords, which lets Chris exile 3 creatures. He hits the Big Mountain, Obuun, and the Stirring Wildwood. This has Derek gaining 20 life, and Chris then takes 4 from the unblocked land, and Derek passes. I draw, and play an island. I then turn all of my creatures sideways, swinging at Chris, and hitting him for 8. I then pass. Chris untaps and draws, playing a Marsh Flats, and then losing 1 life to go and find a land. He drops a Sunforger and equips it onto Akiri. Moving to combat, the Extortionist goes at me, with Chris making 2 copies from the Myriad trigger, 1 going at Derek and 1 at Mark. With the tokens entering, Chris gets another 10 treasures. Mark then takes the 1, while Derek blocks with his pig token. In Chris's second main phase, he casts a Goblin Engineer, letting him go and find an artifact to put to his yard. He puts to graveyard a Helm of Kaldra, and then equips a Jitte onto the Stoneforge, passing to Mark. Mark untaps and draws for turn before casting Cherix the Raging Isle in his main phase. We then see a Demonic Embrace attached to the Nemesis of Reason, giving it flying, which surprised me since it looks like it should have flown anyway. Going to combat, the Nemesis heads at me, and I mill my top 10. I then take 6, and Mark passes. Derek draws and asks how many tapped lands his opponents have. I assume he's going to cast a massive mana geyser, but it's actually an Ignition Team. It comes in with a ton of counters on it, and he agrees not to attack Chris this turn if Chris promises not to mess with his stuff. Chris agrees, and Derek then swings the embodiment at me for 5, which I take. I play Riptide Laboratory as my land for turn, and then tap enough for a Galecaster Colossus. It gets a +1/+1 counter from the Sage of Fables thanks to it being a wizard. I then pass, hoping Chris breaks his promise and somehow kills Derek. Chris plays a Hanwar Battlements and taps 2 for Open the Armory. He goes to find a Hammer of Nazan and puts it to hand. He casts it and equips it onto Akiri as it enters. Chris then casts a fancy Lightning Greaves and they get attached to Akiri as well. It doesn't stop there though, as he puts out a Helm of the Host and slaps it onto the dockside with the hammer trigger, letting him attach it for free. Moving to combat, Chris then gets a trigger from the helm, making a token copy of the dockside. This will get him some treasures, but he does it afterwards, swinging Akiri and the Stoneforge at Mark, and the original dockside at Derek. This triggers Myriad, making Chris 2 more tokens of the dockside, tapped and attacking, with 1 headed at Mark and 1 headed at me. This makes him a grand total of 18 treasures with the one he made before, and he also draws 3 cards from Akiri's trigger, seeing his creatures that are equipped attacking. Derek then blocks the dockside with his Piggy token, while Mark blocks Akiri with his Stabby Crabby, and blocks a Stoneforge with 2 Pig tokens. Chris does get to put 2 counters onto his Jitte from the Stoneforge dealing damage, and in his second main phase, he uses 6 treasures to cast the Sun Titan. It comes in, and returns the recently killed Stoneforge to field. He shortcuts, playing out Godo, and then goes to find 2 equipments, 1 for hand and 1 for field. He finds a Shield of Cauldra and an Argentum armor, putting the shield to hand and the armor onto the field. He gets to equip the armor onto the Stoneforge for free because of the hammer ability, and he then plays from hand Sword of Cauldra and Shield of Cauldra. He equips 1 onto the Engineer and 1 onto Godo, passing. Mark draws and is a bit behind on lands. He casts Peer into the Abyss and surprisingly targets Derek, justifying it as a way to deal a good chunk of damage to him now that he has so much life. He's not wrong as Derek loses half of that life, but we're all a bit afraid as Derek does get to draw half of his library. He then passes, saying that Derek can kill Chris if he wants. Derek untaps and draws only 1, which kind of pales in comparison to how many he drew in Mark's turn. He plays out Elish Norn, and with her on the stack, Chris and I do some stuff. I mistakenly think the Sage is going to die, tapping it to bounce the Argentum armor to Chris's hand. Responding to this, Chris activates the Engineer, swapping the armor for the Helm of Cauldra sitting in his graveyard, and doing what Tomer never could, assembling Cauldra. We then lose a bunch of small creatures as Elish Norn's static ability takes effect as she comes in. Derek then plays up Mina and Den, and plays a mountain, animating a plane to the landfall ability from the embodiment. He then drops a forest, and animates the Needle's Fire, which sadly doesn't get its fun bonus abilities, but it is a 6/6. Derek then casts a Terror Eternal, which is a good card for Obuun, and surprisingly taps a Needlespire to help cast Path to Exile on Godo. This prompts Chris to activate a Stoneforger, deattaching it to go and find a spell that costs 4 or less. It's Teferi's Protection, which hits the stack, and I respond once it is, by tapping the Galecaster Colossus to bounce Godo back to his hand. Chris then phases out, and Derek casts a Crucible of Worlds. He moves to combat, hitting me for 7 with the embodiment, and then moves to his end step, returning his lands to normal, and has to discard down to 7. I also tap Mistform to the Galecaster's ability, bouncing the Nemesis back to Mark's hand. I play an island for turn, and pass. Chris phases back in, and untaps. He plays a tapped Emeria, and puts a Blade of Selves onto his Sun Titan. He then pays 1 to activate the fully assembled Cauldra, making a token that gets geared up with all the stuff. He then, in a strange move, puts the Helm of the Host onto it. Heading to combat, he swings the Sun Titan, Akiri, and Cauldra at Derek, with the token copy of the Cauldra from the Helm also swinging at Derek. With the Sun Titan swinging, it triggers Myriad, making 2 copies, 1 swinging at me and 1 going at Mark. With the Sun Titans entering, he brings back Dockside and Stoneforge, getting some treasures and tutor, but they immediately die. Mark then blocks with Cherix, and I block with the Galecaster Colossus. Derek blocks the Sun Titan with his now 6/6 Mina and Den, Akiri with the Pig token, and Cauldra with the Ignition team. He then takes 4 from the Cauldra token that doesn't have the gear, and he exiles the Ignition team because it took damage from a creature equipped with the Sword of Kaldra. Chris then pays 1 white, removing the Blade of Selves from the Sun Titan to make it indestructible. In his second main phase, Chris then activates the assembled Kaldra to make a new legendary token, and sacrifices the old one so he'll have an untapped blocker. He then equips the Sunforger to it, and passes to Mark. Mark casts back to basics in his main phase, and then casts Demonic Embrace from his graveyard, losing some life to cast it onto the Kraken. He goes at Chris, who once more activates the Sunforger by disattaching it, and going to hopefully find an answer. He sadly can't find a way to save himself, but he does use Boros Charm to deal 4 damage to me on his way out. It's at this point that I realize my issue with the Sage of Fables and that it should actually be alive, returning to the field. Derek untaps his basics and plays a forest from his graveyard. He casts Doubling Season, and then plays Nissa, who shakes the world. He downticks her, using her ultimate, and goes to find the forest in his deck. Sadly, that means only 3 at this point. We then see a Mending of Dominaria, which gets 2 Saga counters put onto it or whatever, and Derek does the first and second step back to back, milling 2 and returning a creature to his hand twice. He only grabs a Sylvan Advocate though, and then nothing. Moving to combat, Elesh Norn heads at me, and I bounce it back to his hand by tapping the Galecaster Colossus. Moving to his end step, Derek then discards down to 7. I draw, and remove the +1/+1 counter from the Galecaster Colossus with my Sage of Fables to draw a card. I then pass to Mark. Mark draws and plays an island. He recasts Wrexial, and then swings at Derek with the Flying Kraken. Derek has no choice but to take the hit, and Mark passes. Derek untaps and draws and puts his final Saga counter onto the Mending Dominaria, returning all lands from his graveyard to the field, and then shuffling his graveyard into his library. He decides against animating them with the Embodiment landfall trigger, and instead casts a Sylvan Advocate. He then casts a Waker of the Wild, which is in the precon, and recasts Elesh Norn. Iris then joins the Garage Band, not to mention makes blocking a real problem, and Derek further compounds on this by dropping Earth Surge. His land creatures are now big beefy boys, and he animates the Windswept Heath with the Waker, putting 2 counters onto it, which is doubled by Doubling Season. He then animates another Fetch, Arid Mesa for the same, which has it getting double counters as well. He then does it for the Horizon Canopy. Moving to combat, Derek asks if I want to potentially fight over first, and I agree, tapping some wizards to bounce Mark's Wrexial to hand. Derek then swings some huge lands in the Embodiment, and even with the Stabby Crabby for blocks, Mark is taken out. At the end of turn, I bounce some stuff back to Derek's hand, and flash out Narumeha. I then tap her to bounce Mina and Den, and move to my turn. I untap and draw. I tap the Grand Architect for 2 colorless, and use it to cast a Phyrexian Metamorph, losing 2 life to cast the reduced costing artifact. It comes in as a copy of the Grand Architect. I then pay for Washout, naming green, to bounce all green creatures to their owner's hand. This has Derek responding by animating a land with the Waker, and he puts 0 into the X. The land becomes a 0/0, but is pumped by the Earth Surge. He has 1 blocker now, but he can't stop enough, and I swing everything at Derek to take him out. Game review time. So I know that when people see new commanders that have card draw slapped onto them, they're often a bit skeptical because it pushes power levels. I think this is actually pretty okay for something like Boros though, because Akiri can finally reward you for swinging with creatures who are equipped with gear, and possibly losing them as a result. I also like the fact that when push comes to shove, she's able to save those very creatures should you need to. Derek's Obuun deck certainly played a lot more threateningly than the games that I played with the precon. I don't think it takes very much for the deck to be actually good, and cards like Earth Surge are very cheap and easily accessible, and a good way to pump it out. Mark was playing a Kraken/Leviathan/Sea Monster based deck with Wrexial, and it was fun to see such a tribal deck, even though unfortunately for that tribe, they're very expensive cost-wise. Despite the fact that I won, I think my deck only did okay this game. Galecaster Colossus is certainly a house when it resolves, but I seem to flood out very early on, and I think my opener was severely lacking in any kind of draw, or a consistent way to establish some kind of advantage. Please be sure to tune in every Monday and Thursday at 11 AM Eastern Standard Time for a guaranteed new video. You can also follow me on Twitter at MTGMudsta. You can find me on Facebook at facebook.com/mtgmudsta, and lastly, you can check me out when I stream at twitch.tv/mtgmudsta. This video is brought to you in support by my patrons. If you're looking for a way to help out the channel, please be sure to visit the link below. Thank you all for watching this video, and don't forget, friends are just opponents you haven't eliminated yet.